Hello and welcome everyone. We will get started. Thank you very much for joining us today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from all the many countries you join us from. And also thank you for those of you who are making time as you are perhaps heading into a weekend today. I'm your moderator for today's webinar, Sashini Selvaratnam. I'm with ActionAid. We are pleased you could join us today for the launch of this global SDG accountability report. It's the first of its kind that examines the state of SDG accountability. And we have been asking different stakeholders about their experiences and perceptions. So more on this to come shortly. As this is in a webinar mode for Zoom, please ensure that any questions, clarifications, comments can be posed through the chat function. And if you have questions for any one of our panelists, please use the Q&A button, which is located at the bottom of your screen. Our webinar today is divided into three segments. First, we will present you with an overview of our key findings and what was undertaken as part of developing this report. Secondly, we have an interactive session where we are looking forward to hearing about your experiences, your perceptions around SDG accountability at your country, at local, national levels, or your experiences at regional and global levels. Then we are going to look at unpacking the multi-stakeholder dimension of SDG accountability, where we will hear from two panelists. And during all these three sessions, we are requesting you to keep notes or pose these to us in the chat or Q&A function so that we have time at the end to have a more interactive dialogue about the questions emerging from the audience. So with that, let us get started with our first panelist. That's John Romano, who is the coordinator of the Transparency, Accountability and Participation Network, who will run us through the report as well as some of the key findings and takeaways. So John, over to you.
Great, thanks a lot, Sashini, and thanks to all of you for joining us. I know that this is obviously a very busy time, and I think a lot of Zoom fatigue is setting in amongst colleagues. So we very much appreciate your time and attendance here today with us. So I'll just go over what we've done for this report. It's available for download now. You can find it on our website. Really simple to find. It's sdgaccountability.org/report. So I'll walk you all through what we've done for the report and a little bit about, starting out with an introduction to the campaign for a decade of accountability for the SDGs, which this report has been published on behalf of the entire partnership. So an introduction to the campaign itself. We launched last year as a multi-stakeholder partnership, basically, recognizing the multi-stakeholder role of accountability for the SDGs. We always talk about how the role that civil society plays in holding governments accountable, but there are many other ways that many other stakeholder groups, other processes, other engagement opportunities that can help citizens hold governments accountable to the SDGs. So this campaign is really reflective of that multi-stakeholder nature of SDG accountability. You can see all of our partners. I won't go through all of them now, but those are all of our partners at the bottom there. And again, each of these partners represent a network of these various stakeholder groups. So we really wanted to ensure that we reached these other stakeholder groups, and again, through networks is the perfect way to do this. Just about the report itself. So as Sashini mentioned, the SDG Global SDG Accountability Report is really a first of its kind publication. Our objective for it was to examine the state of SDG accountability. So I think one thing to note that this report is not, it is not a report, a progress report, a global progress report or a national progress report on SDG accountability. Things like this have been done before, for example, through SDSN. It's done some really great work to examine progress at the national and global level, very specifically. But this takes stock of where we are for holding governments accountable. What's the state of affairs when it comes to our collective ability to hold duty bearers accountable to the 2030 agenda? I think in general terms, we take a look at where we are, featuring expert insights from colleagues, again, from a wide range of stakeholder groups represented by our partners on this campaign. One of the inputs into this report also came from the Global SDG Accountability Survey, which we also launched last year, really to take stock of where colleagues and participants, where colleagues and experts really felt where some of the challenges are, where some of the opportunities are, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. And then finally, it concludes with concrete recommendations. So taking stock of all of these challenges and areas for improvement, we've really provided some really concrete suggestions for how we can overcome some of these challenges and how we can make the environment for SDG accountability more robust going forward. So just before talking about some of the content of the report, I think it's important for us to kind of define what we mean by SDG accountability. I think in very broad terms, what we mean by SDG accountability is a form of social responsibility and accountability for delivering on the 2030 agenda, primarily from governments who are the primary duty bearers that have committed to the 2030 agenda, the main signatories. And I think we focused on taking a look at how do we approach accountability? What needs to happen? And we came up with three main elements that are prerequisites to effective social accountability. The first is responsibility. So that is to say that governments have a responsibility that is outlined through the 2030 agenda and other international or even national and local commitments. The second is answerability. So that governments are answerable to those, to citizens and people that they are meaning to impact through the 2030 agenda and other international agreements. And the third is enforceability. Is a commitment legally binding or voluntary or not? What is the framework that this agreement is under? I think the second aspect there, answerability, is the main way that we main approach, main lens that we see accountability through for the SDGs, given that the 2030 agenda is a voluntary agenda. It is not technically legally enforceable at the global level. I think what we focused on through the report is an analysis of how governments are accountable because of their responsibility and their answerability. And because it's a voluntary agenda, it really underscores the approach that we've taken with this report and with the campaign overall, is seeing this through a multi-stakeholder perspective. To ensure that governments are held accountable, we really need to ensure that a wide range of stakeholders are involved, again, including civil society. Citizens and civil society need to also engage with parliamentarians who are responsible for setting and making laws in countries and also holding government administrations responsible. national human rights institutions, similar in approach, holding governments and duty bearers accountable, journalists in the media, obviously providing as much information about the current state of affairs in a particular country or context. Academia obviously can provide really independent and critical feedback and inputs into especially the 2030 agenda and around accountability. Donors and philanthropy also can play a key role and will undoubtedly play a key role in helping to support colleagues that need support the most. Local grassroots groups in particular, I think is a big challenge that we had identified in the report. We need to find better ways to ensure that local and grassroots groups are better funded and supported. Obviously, international multilateral organizations like the UN or UN funds and agencies are also really important for SDG implementation and accountability. Social movements, seen a lot from this over the past few years, in particular, where social movements have mobilized to hold governments accountable, maybe not necessarily to the SDGs overall, but around many issues that are very relevant. And then, of course, finally, government representatives. Governments are not just monolithic institutions. They are also run by individual people, people that also probably most likely care about the SDGs and these issues themselves, but may not necessarily have the capacity or the ability to advance some of these agendas in their own context. So again, how do we involve government representatives to also share this responsibility for accountability? Just a very brief snapshot of where we are when it comes to the SDG accountability, which we've outlined in the report. I won't go into too much detail here because, again, I think it is very worth unpacking this yourselves through the report. I think it is a very worthwhile read. But I think in overall terms, I think the overall state of accountability, as we found from the report, is not particularly bright. I think we've seen over the past few years, in particular, downward trends around shrinking civic space, around governments that, in particular, are not as willing to engage, around policymaking or accountability in general, let alone towards the SDGs. And I think one of the things that we've found, especially from the Global SDG Accountability Survey from last year, is that many colleagues felt that they had been engaged in the VNR process, but not necessarily that their government had provided entry points after their VNR process. So I think we have to see the SDG engagement process as more than just engaging in the VNR process. How do we move beyond that? How do governments ensure that a wider range of stakeholders are involved in policymaking, are involved in reporting, are involved in accountability in general? So I think the main point is that governments do need to provide more entry points to engage with stakeholders around the SDGs overall. And then I think that also then provides a space for mutual accountability when you have those opportunities for engagement. The report also takes a bit of a look at the impact of COVID-19 on SDG accountability. We also asked this question from colleagues in the Global SDG Accountability Survey as well. I think it shouldn't be much of a surprise that COVID-19 has had a negative impact on SDG accountability. It's magnified some of the existing challenges to accountability and social cohesion overall, including around the SDGs. But I think the one thing that it has really underscored is that there is a very critical relationship between the state and its citizens. I think the shrinking of civic space as a result of COVID-19 has had a negative impact on many things related to, again, policymaking, social accountability, and overall around SDG implementation and accountability. I think some of the reflections from this is that I think we really need to see the response and recovery, and then building resilience from COVID-19 through an SDG lens. The UN also has this catchphrase: "We need to build back better." I think we really need to build back better through the SDG lens. One thing that we've also kind of reflected on a little bit in this report is how the COVID-19 pandemic also represents a really good test for the international community in its efforts to leave no one behind, particularly when it comes to access to critical health services in the response to COVID-19, but then also around ensuring equitable distribution of vaccines. The phrase, "nobody is safe until everybody is safe," comes to mind here. We need to collectively ensure that no one is left behind when it comes to preventing future outbreaks like COVID-19, and again, responding to the COVID-19 challenge currently. Just a few insights. I mentioned before that we had launched this Global SDG Accountability Survey last year, which really served as the impetus for this report. So one thing that we've also done through this report is synthesize the inputs that we got from this report. I won't go into too much detail on all of this, but again, you can find a lot more in the report itself. One of the things that we asked is about colleagues' perceptions of challenges to SDG accountability. And you can see a breakdown here of where most colleagues rated those challenges the highest. The higher the score, the more significant the challenge. There were many challenges that I think we will also reflect on in the recommendations section. So this survey was also very helpful for us to collectively identify not just where the challenges were, but how do we respond to them. Also ask colleagues about their perception of their own government's accountability. I think we were expecting somewhat low scores, but I don't think this low of scores we were really anticipating. You can see the global average is about 2 out of 5. This is completely also non-scientific. The amount of data we collected, I don't think we can claim to be statistically significant, but this is, I think, a general reflection of colleagues that work on SDGs overall and their reflections on the state of accountability. I think one of the things that we identified as a key challenge to SDG accountability overall is that public awareness of the SDGs is very low in many countries. Many colleagues also rated this very high as a challenge, and through their reflections on what needs to be improved as prerequisites to holding governments accountable, is that we really need to do a better job in countries of promoting why the SDGs are important. And again, COVID-19 provides a really great opportunity for that, for us to say governments need to see the COVID-19 response and recovery through the SDG lens. I won't go into too much detail here on the recommendations. Again, there are many, many concrete recommendations that we provide in the report. This is just an overview of the main points that we touch on, the main categories of recommendations. Specifically, we also provide really concrete recommendations directed to specific stakeholder groups. So, for example, many of the recommendations include specific suggestions for what governments need to do on a particular topic, or how can civil society support, or collectively as a global community, what do we need to push forward? So these recommendations are very specific. They are tailored to specific stakeholder groups. So I do hope that it is helpful to colleagues in your own work or in your own advocacy in helping to identify, for this particular issue, government stakeholders might be the best to target. This is what we need to share with them to enhance SDG accountability. So Again, I'll let you all unpack that. I think it is a very good collection of recommendations, very comprehensive. And then just finally on what comes next. What we hope from this report is that it's a solid foundation to build upon. We've really taken stock of where the challenges are and where we need to go going forward. And in a lot of ways, that the recommendations chapter features, I think a roadmap for this campaign overall to examine where we need to focus our efforts going forward. So we will follow up on this report, identifying some of those key areas for us to collectively follow up on as a campaign, and maybe advance work around some of these challenges and recommendations. And then again, because all of these, the partners in this campaign are global networks of these stakeholders themselves, we will also engage with these communities. Again, if one particular area has a particular focus on a stakeholder group that may be critical to mobilizing around this issue, I think this also makes it hopefully a bit easier for us to mobilize and engage with different stakeholder groups. You can also visit our website. You can show support, become an SDG accountability champion. You'll have a push pin on our map. This is really for us to help mobilize around SDG accountability going forward. And of course, you can tweet with the hashtag SDG accountability to share your experiences and reflections on SDG accountability. And then, of course, finally, I think, again, downloading and reading the report, I do feel that it's very comprehensive. Again, I think this is just the starting point for our work around SDG accountability together. So we're also keen to hear from colleagues that are doing really concrete things to advance SDG accountability in your own contexts. I think going forward, we'd love to showcase some of these efforts, provide case studies of where colleagues can learn from one another. So we really want to build out this community of stakeholders working on SDG accountability from here. So there's a lot more that we can do collectively going forward, but I think I'll stop there. It's quite a lot to unpack in the report itself, so I really do hope you have a chance to go through that report, and if you have any questions at all, happy to answer any questions here or away from this webinar. So thanks again.
Thanks, John. We have actually some questions coming up, so I will hold them till we get to the last session when we can address this with you and the other panelists on the webinar today. So now we are moving on to the second segment, and this is actually an interactive session, and I can see that we have our numbers of participants have increased quite a lot since we got going. We'd like you to open up your web browser or use your mobile device and go to menti.com, www.menti.com. And the QR code is coming up shortly on the screen. So we would we'll be ready to open up for the poll fairly soon. There we go. So if you go to www.menti.com, then please use the code 4847 space 3679. And this is just a question to get you warmed up. We are interested to know which stakeholder group do you represent. I can see about 1/3 of us on this webinar have answered the survey or have logged on to Menti. So let me encourage you again to go on to menti.com, either on your website or mobile device. At the QR code, the code that you see at the top of the slide 48473679. So far, of the 1/3 of us who have responded on Menti, many of us represent civil society, but we also see representatives from intergovernmental organizations, national human rights institutions, academia, and other. And very curious to know who falls into the other categories. So if there are a few brave souls, please feel free to drop in the chat what is the other stakeholder group that we missed. We have more participants from private sector. I noted the question around private sector as well while John was presenting the key findings. We'll keep this open for another minute and then look to move on to our next question. All right, so you can keep adding because I can see that you are definitely getting warmed up with your fingers and your thumbs, depending what device you're using. We have 23 from civil society of those who answered this poll, 3 from other, so research advisory institutes, I understand is perhaps one of the types for under the other, 5 from intergovernmental organizations in the UN, 3 from national human rights institutions, 2 from private sector, 3 from academia. Please keep adding on. And let's move to the second question. So this is about rating your perceptions of SDG accountability. Your first option is overall, I'm satisfied with the state of SDG accountability in my country. Second, overall, I'm satisfied with the global state of SDG accountability. Number 3, my government has actively engaged in broader stakeholders in SDG processes. And your fourth option, to date, my government has made adequate political and financial commitments to leave no one behind in the SDG implementation. As you can see, the scale is between strongly disagree to strongly agree. And we have, I guess, across all the 4 areas, we are still having people responding, the audience members responding to the poll. We'll give this another few minutes as well. So to summarize, from those who have responded, it looks like option 2, which is talking about the global state of SDG accountability, is where we have scored 2.4. So we are somewhere in the middle, getting closer, at least, inching slowly on that spectrum from strongly disagree to agree. Then SDG accountability, or the state of it in my country, and the government's engagement of broader stakeholders is coming in next, and they're closely tied with the same rating. And then where we can see some of the areas to improve based on your perceptions is on political, the adequate political will and financial commitments on actually reaching the furthest behind first, as all member states committed to over, I guess, close upon 6 years now, 7, getting up to that. All right, let's move on to our final question. So here we are interested in getting some of your ideas on the top 3 greatest challenges that you see from your view of related to SDG accountability. So you can bring your experiences either from the local level, your engagements at the national level, as well as in your region or sub-region and globally. As a lot of you most probably have quite good experience using Mentimeter now, you know that this is a word cloud, and if you see the numbers in the words in big and bold, it means this is also because many of you are saying these are amongst your top 3. And in the middle is, of course, the key area popping up around finance, funding. Quite a lot of inputs because I can't read as fast enough as it changes. So let's see what ends up in the middle. There is also close tie-in with funding is political awareness, political will and awareness. I also see commitment, participation, coordination, transparency. I know a couple of you mentioned about capacity. Both, I imagine this is with governments, civil society, communities. You can, of course, see also from the Global SDG accountability report about what are some of the challenges and areas for strengthening for different stakeholder groups. Quite a lot of information coming in. There are also other areas highlighted in terms of trust, corruption, data. Very key one, not only looking at official data, but also looking at civil society generated or community driven data, and how this is part of accountability in at your local or national level in the country. Budgets, of course, tying into that conversation around funding and finances. Coordination, of course, so not only that civil society or government or the stakeholders are coordinating amongst themselves, but then also the integration coming in. So perhaps with that, we will look to end this very interactive Mentimeter. Also very good to know that it takes a couple of questions to get you warmed up before you start to add in your perceptions and points. Now to our third segment, where we are going to be unpacking on multi-stakeholder engagement and what does it mean for SDG accountability. So joining us is Sainara Konigris, who is with the Danish Institute for Human Rights. Welcome, Sainara, and Javier Suraski with CPI, which is also part of the Together 2030 network.
Hi everyone.
Hi, Sainara. Yes, of course.
Should I get started?
Yes, please do.
Thank you, Sashini. It's really a privilege to be here in the launch of such an important report, and having read through it, I can really recommend the reading. I will be talking more specifically today on the role of national human rights institutions as one of the accountability actors for the SDGs, as it has already been mentioned by John in his presentation earlier today. As I hope most of you will know by now, most SDGs derive from legally binding human rights treaties and conventions. And right now we are living through a pandemic where it's not optional to talk about access to health in the context of SDG 3, for example, or social protection only in the context of SDG 1. These are human rights. And what it means is that states don't have the luxury to look at the SDGs as just an aspirational commitment. When we look at them closer, we can see that more than 90% of the SDGs are linked to legally binding human rights treaties and conventions, which states have voluntarily signed up to commit to them. And that is why national human rights institutions come to the picture as an important accountability actor. National human rights institutions, and from now on I will call them NHRIs to facilitate my speech here, are a sort of a strange animal. We are a state institution, but we are not government. And as such, we should actually act independently from government to ensure our oversight mandate and ensure accountability in our work. NHRIs have a constitutional or a legislative mandate to promote human rights in the countries where they are established. The establishment of those NHRIs was actually conceptualized to strengthen the accountability for human rights obligations. They are part of this institutional setup that links accountability from the national level with the international level. And I will get to that just in a bit. And this is something that we don't really have for the SDGs. So it's important that we understand how those issues are connected and how those institutions working for human rights can also help improve accountability for the SDGs. At home, at national level, the NHRIs, they act, for example, assessing the impact, the human rights impact and implications of legislations, of policies, but also of business activity, for example, related to mega projects, to environmental impact of those projects, to the human rights impact of environmental or energy projects, for example. Some of the NHRIs also have a quasi-judicial mechanism, as we call it, where people can actually submit their complaints related to the violation of human rights. At the international level, these NHRIs report to the accountability mechanism of the UN, which we call the Human Rights Monitoring Mechanism, which monitors the state's compliance with those human rights obligations, which, as I said, are strictly related to the SDGs. They also produce recommendations to the states to overcome what it means, offering solutions on how to overcome the neglect or negligence or violation of human rights. And they periodically follow up on those recommendations. So you can see where I'm getting here in terms of the experience that we have with accountability under the human rights system. No? And so when we look at the work of NHRIs combined with the work of these human rights mechanisms, there is a generation of information and data which is extremely relevant for the SDGs. These institutions, they also generate action and they generate accountability. That's why, again, working with them is so important, and understanding their role, understanding how to engage with them can further accountability for the SDGs by cross-pollinating the information that we, or the reports that we produce for one and for the other, but also understanding the implication of development policies from a human rights perspective and in light of the state's human rights obligations. I think it's a common agreement that accountability structure for the SDGs at the global level is weak. So when we look at the SDGs, or when we are capable of looking at the SDGs from the human rights lenses, we will become able to leverage the work that is produced by NHRIs, by the human rights mechanisms, and we'll also be able to create opportunities to improve SDG accountability, both at national level, but also at the global level. This does not mean that we should all become experts, or that there is an expectation to become experts in human rights as well as we are on SDGs. On the contrary, and that's why we have focused from the Danish Institute for Human Rights in developing tools that facilitates the work in connecting SDGs and human rights. For example, one of them can give you easy access to the links between each of the SDG targets and how they connect to all of the human rights instruments, conventions, declarations, treaties out there. Also with labor standards, with environmental treaties. This can facilitate a lot our work in understanding how they are connected. Another tool that is also freely available online is linking all those recommendations that I mentioned that are produced by the UN human rights mechanisms with the SDGs, which can also facilitate the follow-up of those recommendations through the accountability mechanisms and institutions established to follow up on human rights obligations and those recommendations with an SDG lens, and be able to use that to demonstrate the value of those accountability mechanisms for SDG processes as well. And finally, the last tool that I wanted to share with you today is related specifically to the context of sustainable recovery, where we put together all of these two tools that I mentioned, the information and the wealth of knowledge and guidance that is produced by the human rights mechanisms and institutions in the context of COVID-19, together into a tool that facilitates access to linking the human rights issues and the SDGs in its relevance for the sustainable recovery efforts. And finally, as you will see in the SDG accountability report, we have several examples of how NHRIs are concretely using their mandate to further accountability for the SDGs, be it engaging with the VNR processes, providing data, or collaborating with the statistics office to promote better data, more disaggregated, that can actually serve the purpose of leaving no one behind, but also facilitating dialogue with different stakeholder actors in trying to, again, promote the Leave No One Behind principle in the 2030 agenda from a very concrete and substantive standard that is offered by the human rights instruments. So please read it, learn more about the national human rights institutions in your country, engage with them, and make sure that we are all building together towards more stronger accountability for the SDGs as well, leveraging the human rights knowledge and processes and institutions. I think I reached my 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Sashini. Back to you.
Thanks a lot, Sainara. I think we also had a few members of the audience who likes your background poster. So have let them know where they can purchase a copy should they want one, which is an easy way to learn one's SDGs, isn't it? And thank you as well, Javier, for posting the website link for the Danish Institute for Human Rights to connect with all the wonderful points that Sainara shared with us. Welcome on board, Javier. You're with CPI, which is also part of the Together 2030 network. So let me pass it over to you now to wrap up this section. But Sainara and John, don't go too far away. We'll be opening up for questions after Javier. Over to you, Javier.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I think that the issue that we are discussing is really a core issue when we consider the 2030 agenda implementation and where we are right now. The first thing I want to highlight is that I wonder with the results of the poll that we just take. When I saw that, we all felt slightly more comfortable with the global level than with the national level. I mean, the punctuation that the accountability gets at the global level was slightly beyond the punctuation that the national level reached. And I think that it is a good point to start thinking why the 2030 agenda is still important, still relevant when we talk about accountability. Maybe we should start reminding that the follow-up and review mechanism that the 2030 agenda established in 2015 operates at the national, regional, and global level with the end of promoting accountability to citizenship. And that is written in paragraph 73 of the agenda. So we need to read the agenda if we really care about accountability, because much of the problems that we are facing right now came or have solutions in the commitments assumed by the states in the 2030 agenda. The problem is that sometimes we tend to look at the 2030 agenda as it is the same that the SDGs, and the SDGs are only a part of the agenda. I think that we as civil society, as stakeholders, should come back to the text of the 2030 agenda, reread it in the new framework in which we are, and we will find a lot of tools and possibilities to work toward a strengthened accountability system. Having said that, let me say that the perspectives that we are seeing right now are not in the direction that I think that we all expect or desire. As you know, the HLPF is under reform, and a couple of days ago, the final version of long drafting process was adopted by the states. Let me share with you some references that are directly linked to accountability in the HLPF to come, in the new HLPF. The first things that I want to highlight is that the draft that was shared on May and the draft that the final draft approved on June, some important things fade away, important things to a stronger accountability system. For example, in the previous version, we can read that countries were encouraged to involve all relevant parts of governments at all levels and relevant institutions, as well as major groups and other stakeholders in the various steps and phases of the VNRs in accordance with some paragraphs of the agenda. However, this paragraph disappeared in the last version, in the approved version. Another issue, in the May version, the countries were asked to conduct voluntary reviews to inform their citizens on the progress of the implementation of the 2030 agenda. That phrase was changed, and now what we are asking the countries is to raise awareness, not to inform. It's slightly but deep differences. And if we are talking about nuances, the May draft invited countries to consider the inclusion of major groups and other stakeholders in the preparation and follow-up of their VNRs, as well as to consider including them in their delegation at the HLPF. But the final version only said that countries could consider including major groups and other relevant stakeholders in their delegation at the forum. That means countries are not pushing hard for more accountability, for a more open HLPF. Countries are not moving in the direction that we want. So we will need to force them in a certain way to retake the right direction. How we can do that? I think that we have many options. Again, I think that the first is to read again the 2030 agenda and identify commitments related to accountability and ask our governments to comply with their promises. But we also have some different tools. I think that Sayonara mentioned the relationships between commitments, binding commitments in the field of human rights and SDGs. So I think that this is a good way to ask the governments to become more accountable, based on human rights binding commitments. But we also should create networks and spaces in our countries working to promote accountability with the particular objective of promoting accountability. And that means that is something that no one can do alone. I mean, we need to work with other stakeholders, not only with other civil society organizations. We need to create networks that are open and participative, including the private sector, philanthropists, and including also the government, because sometimes it's very difficult to take with the to talk with the central governments, to open a dialogue with the central government. But it is much more easy to find a counterpart in the parliaments. Sometimes it's really difficult to talk about human rights with central offices, but you can go to the kind of institutions that Sayonara was pointing out. I mean, we need to find what are the right entry points to promote a more accountable system. And we need to work with all of that can work with us and join efforts. Because the only way in which we have a more accountable structure is if we can make that the political price of not being accountable will be higher than the price that the government should pay if it is accountable. I mean, we vote, we decide, and the governments know it. So we need to bring the discussion regarding accountability to the political discussion. And this is maybe the main challenge we have. And if we can do that, linking accountability with the 2030 agenda, accountability with human rights, and accountability with the main goals of each country, we will take a very strong first step to go in the right direction. That's what I wanted to share with you as ideas. I think that it's a lot of work behind us to do. And this new report and maybe the chance of mobilizing wills to work together around this issue that could came from this report, it's also part of that strong first step that I was referring to. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Javier. And maybe I can ask Sayonara, John, and Javier, don't go too far. Please turn on your videos and open your mics. We have received some questions from the audience, and maybe I can take the first one and ask for a round of comments from each of you. And this is very much on the fact that at the moment we are living in a world where we are talking about SDG accountability, but the reality for many countries is also the pandemic, where it's in a third, fourth, perhaps moving on to a fifth wave. And so the question is that there is global doubt about SDG achievement by 2030, especially for least developed and developing countries. because of the pandemic. The question is, how is the accountability report discussion now addressing this, or can we think about how does accountability look like given where we are now? And perhaps Javier, I can start with you.
Yes, I will come back with what I guess is a short answer.
Sure.
The first thing to underline here is that to build forward better and to understand how countries are managing national response and the international response to COVID-19 and its effect, we need to develop accountability. We need to understand and to know how countries are making decisions in this very complex moment. So accountability in the framework of COVID and facing a response and recovery process is more important than before. That's the first thing that I wanted to highlight. And the second issue, it's maybe a risky invitation. Maybe it's not so important if we really reach the SDGs in 2030. It will be very difficult, and we knew it since the very beginning. Maybe the best thing that we can do is to take the decade that we have ahead of us to try to pave the way to move towards the direction that the SDGs and the 2030 agenda is pointing to. So my invitation is keep your faith in the SDGs, keep working to reach the SDGs, but reaching it or not in fully is not a real problem. The real problem is moving the right direction and keep moving the right direction. On 2030, on 2040, on 2050, and we will to continue this work maybe for a long time because the work is very complex and there are many things to do.
Thank you very much, Javier. Sayonara, John, do you want to jump in?
Sure, and I will build on the optimism from Javier as well. And also, I mean, pointing out to one of the problems and perhaps, you know, one of the issues that we need to work on in order to overcome this what seems to be a fact now more than ever with how the pandemic has really turned us in the opposite direction if we were already, as if we were not already so late for achieving the goals by 2030. I think one of the things that the pandemic has also shown is that, and especially looking from a human rights perspective, is that what we are seeing right now in the proportion to which especially the most vulnerable have been hit by the pandemic, not only in terms of countries, but also in terms of populations within countries, is a consequence and a reflection from these long-standing overdue commitments that were already based on human rights obligations that exists for decades, commitments that already are in place for decades. So looking at how do we build coherence to make sure that we build in the direction that Javier was just mentioning before, that we are building the foundations and the grounds for achieving the SDGs, either if we call it SDGs by 2030, or achieving those human rights obligations which are completely interrelated with the most of our capacities that we have in countries. I mean, what we see so often is a waste of resources, a waste of expertise, a waste of data, of information, because we are dealing with those two similar issues in completely separate structures at countries. So what we are really calling here is also for coherence in the way that countries are addressing this. And I think it also comes from civil society as well, with the responsibility of, you know, flagging that as concretely as possible to countries on how to do it, on, you know, using those tools to make that point of the long-standing obligations, which are the solutions or the directions that those human rights mechanisms have been pointing for so long to achieve the SDGs in accordance with that and with as much coherence and efficiency as well in those processes.
Thanks, Sayonara. Over to you, John.
Great. Yeah. I also think that, I mean, in addition to what Javier and Sayonara have mentioned, I also think that viewing things, the COVID response, recovery, and then building more resilient societies and institutions going forward. I think SDG 16 can play a big role. I'm a little bit biased because we are, as a network, work on SDG 16, of course, but I think one of the reflections from COVID-19 up to this point is that in general terms, we've seen countries that have had a really strong institutional response do better in pushing back COVID-19 and preventing the worst impacts that we've seen. And countries that haven't had a strong institutional response do considerably worse. I think COVID-19 in general has exposed some of the deep existing cracks that have existed before the pandemic, but has really exposed them and actually widened them in a lot of cases. So I think the focus on investing more in institution building, an area that we've collectively neglected for decades, a chronic problem of underfunding and undersupporting institutions, not just government institutions, but other external institutions as well. And again, one of the, I mentioned this a little bit before, but one of the challenges that we're facing is, I think unequal and uneven access to vaccines, for example. I think the system itself, the international system itself, and that commitment to leaving no one behind, if we can't if we can't, from a global crisis, effectively get governments and institutions to really enact their commitment to leaving no one behind, if we can't do this in a global crisis, it doesn't look good for how we leave no one behind when it comes to other SDG related issues. So I do think that COVID-19 does represent a good litmus test for the global community on how we do in leaving no one behind. Again, in response to crises, in response to slower burning crises like climate change, for example, I do think this is a really important test for us.
Thanks, John. And maybe perhaps knowing that we are slightly over time, just a final question. So then as civil society, and this is going back to the report, but also from the different seats that each of you sit, the stakeholders you represent, how do you think civil society can demand and make sure that their governments at local, national level are meeting those needs of the most vulnerable communities, especially given the current political context? And here I think it's also referring back to saying there are challenges, and political will was one that was quite big in our word cloud. So I wondered what civil society could demand from, and who might be those stakeholders that they should consider to leverage, to influence, to see that change in their communities.
Should I start again?
Sure, why not? Go ahead, Harvey.
First of all, let me say that I think that it is not possible to identify the right stakeholder to leverage the work that civil society could do. It depends on different countries, frameworks, political will of the different actors. I take the opportunity to say that we are not excluding the private sector, or the opposite. In fact, the private sector was invited to speak in this webinar. Sadly, they are not here, but we are considering as a very important partner the private sector, of course. And I think that the main problem, if we want to create political will, is to create the demand for change in the basis. And to create the demand for change in the basis, we need data, and we need clear and understandable data. In the last days, we listened and read lots of papers explaining how the COVID-19 that you mentioned will be worsen the possibility or will make impossible to reach the SDGs. I want to look at it in a different angle and share with you what I'm thinking. I think that it is time to think on how not to fulfill the commitments made in the first 5 years since the 2030 Agenda adoption is responsible for some of the worst effects of the COVID-19. We cannot blame the COVID-19 for everything. And we can find that if we have been working much more seriously in the 2030 Agenda in the implementation, we will have at hand much more tools to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. So it is a circle. It have not a point in which we can decide here the story starts. So join every possible partner to leverage your action and do your best to create and share data, official and non-official data. There are lots of data tools that you can take advantage free in the network, in internet. So work with it, share the information, be sure that your constituencies are aware of what has happened. That is the first step.
Should I go again following the order of the
Sure.
yes. I mean, again, taking it from where Javier stopped on data, and this is also an invitation for everyone who wishes to attend. On the 8th of July, we are launching the report of the SDG data partnerships, which was an experiment in a way done during the COVID-19. So it had to be transformed completely virtually, where we worked with 6 countries and trying to bring the different actors or key actors that we have identified, including the NHRI, civil society, the national SDG focal point, and the statistics office, exactly with that purpose of establishing the ground for the production and, most importantly, the use of data that is produced by this variety of actors to improve SDG accountability and to help leave no one behind from the voices of the different actors on the ground. I would also like to point out to any study that just came out, I think 2 days ago, from the German Development Institute, where it's looking specifically to 3 actors in country where they're calling the key accountability actors. And those are, one of them is the NHRI, but also the Supreme Audit Institutions and parliaments as, you know, natural allies of civil society in working to improve accountability for the SDGs. Again, thinking about the amount of information and an independent assessment that those institutions can do that can also be leveraged in spotlight reports or to receive support from the other actors as well when those are presented, for example, for national monitoring efforts, including the voluntary national reviews. But also thinking about the role of parliaments as one of the key, sometimes the only possible solution with the rise of autocratic regimes and so on, and thinking about that avenue to be able to develop legislations that can help improve and further the implementation of the SDGs and improve accountability and developing transparency mechanisms as well, together with actors such as Parliament. So just to mention some here. Thanks.
Yeah, and I like going last speaking, because I'll just say I agree with everything that Javier and Sayonara have said. I think also, just coming back to my point on the institution building side of things, I mean, I think what we've seen, especially in recent years, you know, even some currently ongoing now, I think we've seen a lot of protest movements, social movements demanding accountability from their governments and really focusing on deep-rooted institutional issues in their own countries and contexts. And I think this happens. I mean, protests like these happen because governments generally have, over a period of time, lacked a focus on people. So people-centered policies that the SDGs are really all about, the leaving no one behind agenda. This is one of the big pitches that we should be making to governments to say, this is why the SDGs are relevant. This isn't just an agenda, obviously to help people in your country. This is good for you because it ensures that your policies are people-centered, and so that you are ensuring that you don't have a situation where there are mass mobilizations against your government for being for leaving people behind. And protests happen because people feel left behind. So I think that's a key thing that we need to make a pitch to governments around. And I think also, sometimes we often say that, you can't measure political will, but I think political will can be measured, I think, through financing and budgets. And I think that's another point that we also need to focus on. Again, when it comes to institution building, we have the financing. In many cases, in so many countries around the world, at the global level, the issue is not having the finance. I mean, it's there, the capacity is there. In many cases, we just need to allocate funding better. I mean, for example, a great example of this is, how about we shift the trillions going towards military spending and put that towards people-centered policies. I mean, if that funding went to support policies and programs that help people in country, we wouldn't be really talking about the capacity or funding issue at all. So I think it's really about a reprioritization of priorities for countries. And someone also mentioned the private sector. There is a chapter on the private sector in the Global SDG Accountability Report. But to that point as well, how do we leverage the private sector to also reshift government's priorities and how they approach development policy? Because I think in many ways, governments in a lot of countries, policymaking revolves around appeasing the private sector, ensuring foreign investment, or ensuring that the private sector is robust in these countries. I think there also needs to be an equal focus on, again, how can the private sector also help advance the SDGs in this sense? How can they also be accountable to the SDGs? Governments are primary duty bearers, but for institutions of great influence, like big private institutions, we need to also see how we can leverage these large institutions and companies as well. So we could talk for 4 hours about how we do this, but one pitch I'll just make is that we also, as the TAP network, have a resource called the SDG Accountability Handbook. It's very simple to find. It's just sdgaccountability.org, which provides really concrete guidance for particularly civil society colleagues on how they can advance SDGs accountability in their own context. So also a useful resource that colleagues might find helpful as well.
Thanks, John, Javier, and Sayonara. I think we have gone slightly over time. But I think it's also a great way of ending, talking more about the people focus or citizen focus of accountability, and making sure that at the national level or at subnational level, it is actually reaching the most marginalized communities and groups and people. That, of course, this is not something new. We were trying to put this in focus when we had the 2015 agenda adopted by all countries, and wanting to recognize that. And where we are now 6 years into it is also saying we haven't really done a great job. So how can we redouble it? And the pandemic is showing us that it has not been done. So the work we need to do on it. And then great point on financing as well, because again, it's reallocation of funding. So perhaps if this is held at national level, then what can be done at district or province or regional level, and how can that improve services of health, of education, taking into the consideration the needs of women, of young people, of ethnic, religious minorities, and others. So let's close on that note, but also recognizing that the webinar, the presentations, and all the resources, including the Global SDG Accountability Report, can be found on the website sdgaccountability.org. Sayonara and Javier, I know you have been dropping a lot of links in the chat as well. So perhaps looking through the webinar again, everyone will be able to access these resources. If not, please reach out to us. Thank you everyone for joining us, because I think it's a good afternoon and good night to most people who joined us now. And have a good rest of the day. Thank you again.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.